Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Kiki Freedman. Kiki, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Very happy to be here. I'm Kiki Freedman, the CEO and co-founder of Hey.
Thanks for coming on today. So what is Hey Jane?
We are a digital clinic for sexual and reproductive health, trying to bring access to high quality care to everyone. And our primary focus so far has been medication abortion pills via telemedicine.
I'm very interested in talking to you today. You co-founded the company in 2020, I assume during the pandemic, when suddenly telemedicine became something necessary for lots of people who had never used it before. What were you thinking when you started this?
Yeah. So I actually started working on Hey in 2019. So right before the
Okay,
pandemic.
so you're ahead of the
And
curve.
we were a little bit ahead of the curve. There were a number of highly influential timing factors that I could chat through, but we definitely we definitely saw sort of, where the trend was moving in terms of abortion access, having historically been quite bad in this country, but definitely getting worse. We saw clinics closing, the rise in trap laws, really all across the country.
And
Um,
what is a trap law?
Oh, a trap law is one of these ridiculous anti-scientific, anti-clinical laws that put additional restrictions on abortion providers to make it harder for them to provide care, either by
Mhm.
increasing their costs or just making it unnecessarily complicated.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. So we'd seen the rise in digital health, this sort of consumer-facing model, but it had really focused to date on sort of lifestyle products, mostly for men, things like hair loss, erectile dysfunction. But I did find it really interesting as the means of increasing access to stigmatized care, and started wondering, could we do this for safe, discreet, affordable abortion care?
So how did the pandemic then shape the company? Was it the fact that suddenly everyone was using this? Was that sort of a boon to a weird boon to your idea of what it could be?
So there are a few things. Certainly, as you mentioned, massive spike in awareness and comfort and acceptability of telemedicine as a whole. But something fairly unique to medication abortion is that prior to the pandemic, the regulations were broadly interpreted as the abortion pill could only be dispensed in a physical setting, in a doctor's office, hospital, or clinic. And the way that had traditionally been read was sort of like the provider must physically hand the pills to the patient within the four walls of the clinic. We were designing an operational model that we felt, to be compliant with those old regulations, but it was somewhat complicated. During the pandemic, those laws changed, and the FDA, changed the restrictions to more explicitly allow for telemedicine dispensing of the abortion pill. So that really opened up the opportunity for us to provide this service at scale, totally legally within well-defined frameworks.
So how has your practice changed or been affected by Roe versus Wade being overruled in 2022?
Yeah. Okay. So there have been cascading effects, as you might imagine. I think first order, what we saw was number one, an immediate increase in patient demand. We know that bans do not reduce the number of folks getting an abortion. This is essential healthcare. People will find a way to get it. But what it did mean was that people were needing to find new ways to receive it. In person clinics in states where abortion remained legal were suddenly absorbing, substantially larger numbers of patients, often in ways that led to huge increases in wait times. People needed more means of access. And so telemedicine was really available. Hey Jane was available as a scalable way to help those patients out. We also saw, of course, a really steep rise in the level of anxiety among our patients, a number of questions that we were facing often for the first time about legality of care, from substantial, shares of our patients. We also had to relocate a number of our providers. Our medical director, for example, was based in Ohio. For the first month or so after the Dobbs decision, she drove every single day to Pennsylvania to open up her laptop and
Oh wow.
provide care virtually, which is sort of an incredible thing if you think about it. Over time, one thing that I will say is that, since the Dobbs decision, abortion pills and telemedicine abortion have become really essential to the care ecosystem. And it's increased awareness of this type of treatment. When we started, only like 1 in 4 people knew that abortion pills even existed. let alone that they were available via telemedicine.
Mhm.
Now, well over half of all abortions are done with pills, and telemedicine has just become much more known as an option, both in part because of jobs, but also because of these other, very dangerous in certain ways, but ultimately kind of silly and distracting lawsuits, trying to put restrictions on it.
Right. So one such lawsuit was decided in this previous Supreme Court term, and it was about the medication abortion that I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, mifepristone. Uh,
Mifepristone, yeah.
okay, thank you. And please, correct me or add any details I'm getting wrong. It was thrown out for lack of standing, and some people were saying it's possible it could come back in a different form that has a better legal, so standing is sort of like a technicality way to throw out a lawsuit. So the conservative anti-abortion legal movement could revive the case in a different form that maybe would be heard again. So how were you worried that you could be shut down after that if that case went the other way, or what were you thinking about that?
I will say, as a founder, I am someone who tends to skew optimistic. So I'll caveat with that. But we did feel that even with the Supreme Court, this particular case was so weak. In order to have standing in, the US court system, you have to have suffered some form of damages. And they were so theoretical in this case. It was a number of providers who um, were arguing they may have suffered damages if they maybe had needed to treat a patient who may have been suffering from side effects of these medications, which, by the way, are really, really safe. Like side effects are super rare. Um, and so, it was a stretch from the beginning. So the
Mhm.
standing case was weak from the outset.
So, and if this comes back in some different form where the standing issue cannot be, is not so obviously like a case that they could swat away with this sort of, technical legal thing, what are you thinking about that? Or this idea of the Comstock Act being revived if, Trump or conservative administration gains power once again?
Yeah. So to answer your first question, it will be very interesting. The case in general set up a pretty extraordinary precedent, opportunity for precedent in the courts being able to essentially overrule clinical evaluations done by the FDA, an expert agency who has trained professionals who are skilled at evaluating safety data, as opposed to a judge who really doesn't know much about the details at all. With the recent change in Chevron deference, I expect that may be relevant to any revivals in this case.
Right.
Um, but I don't want to speculate too much further than that because it really depends how they set it up. A number of states have tried to intervene, claiming that they have standing, but I wouldn't want to speculate too much on how that will play out. And even if they will pursue it, last we checked, they hadn't met one of the filing deadlines. We'll see if that changes.
Okay. What is your background? Do you have a legal background, or are you forced to take a crash course in
Yeah.
law after you came up with this idea? Like, what were you doing before you started this company?
Yeah, I am not a lawyer. I studied public health and business. I did work as an early employee at Uber prior, so I had to get comfortable with businesses in these sort of highly regulated
Hmm.
settings. And I just have kind of a nerdy interest in understanding laws and regulations and how we could achieve things within those boundaries. But I'm lucky to have a very good general counsel and some great external legal support too.
Yeah, I'm thinking the average. I mean, do you see yourselves as sort of like a tech startup, or like the average company like
Yeah.
yours probably does not like have to deal with so many possible legal issues. Like, how do you think about that stuff?
Yes. So we are a tech startup. We are early. We're definitely earlier than most to have as much legal support as we do. But I think that's the fundamental problem that we set out to solve, right? Like we know this medication is safe and effective. There was really no question there, and in my mind, there was really no question as to whether or not patients would want to receive care this way. You hear startups talk about product market fit and the risk of achieving that. To me, that was obvious from day one. Like, of course, people would rather avoid traveling hundreds of miles to reach a clinic, walking through protesters, yelling the most horrible things at you, waiting weeks to get an appointment, and all of this sort of thing. Um, the real problem for us to solve was how do we achieve this in a compliant way? And so I did dive deep into those details from the very beginning.
Mhm. Um, have any state attorney generals or anyone come after your company in particular, or are you fending off lawsuits, or can you comment on that?
Yeah, knock on wood, nothing yet. We really have focused on uh, we will push things as far as we can go within the boundaries of what is compliant, because our ultimate goal is to serve as many patients as possible and continue to exist. Um, that said, I will say there was a state congressman in Texas who tried to create a bill banning Texans from accessing our website, which,
Hmm.
sort of felt like we made it at that point.
Yeah.
It was such a clear violation of the First Amendment. I mean, imagine, but these are the lanes that some folks are willing to go to prevent access to information.
Okay, so you worked at Uber previously, and that company had all sorts of challenges related to both being a tech startup and, disrupting an existing industry, you could say. What are things that are like sort of standard things that happen when you're in a startup versus things that your company's dealing with because you send out medication, abortion medication pills?
Yeah, I mean, listen, abortion is treated differently than anything else as it relates to how it's regulated. At the end of the day, abortion is healthcare, right? It should be regulated based off of clinical safety standards. And unfortunately, it's not. It is, it's evaluated based off these more arbitrary sort of like ethical determinations that ultimately end up affecting patients negatively. We know that being deprived of abortion access puts people in substantially worse financial positions. We know that it substantially affects their ability to escape dangerous relationships, to pursue economic participation in the way that they want. But it is something that people hold strong beliefs one way or the other towards. And so, those are harder and squishier things to sort of battle against from like a scientific perspective, as healthcare should be approached, in my view.
Right. I mean, there probably aren't that many people who have a moral objection to like a taxi ride share, taxi hailing app. And a lot of they'll like fight over these sorts of companies that have to do with, yeah, more like who's going to end up making money off of something like that. So yeah, so that does
It's
seem
a good point.
different to me. Really, how does this viewing this as a company providing a service over the internet? How like how is it sort of like working for Uber, Lyft, or Seamless or something, or not?
It's a good question. I would say like in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. I think the comfort with innovating in this type of model certainly, I think, was, motivated and encouraged by, looking towards some prior models. But with healthcare, like it's just not a move fast and break things industry. It shouldn't be, it can't be. And so we are, of course, much more sensitive to patient safety, but also patient experience. We provide, in addition to the clinical support and the ability for patients to get the abortion pills delivered to their home, we also provide emotional support, online community, and all of these things come with a lot of nuance that needs to be handled with a high degree of thoughtfulness and sensitivity. So, we do A/B testing, we do these types of things to optimize for that user experience, but um, in many ways, we do take a more careful approach, perhaps I'd say, than some other
Okay,
tech
that's interesting.
services.
This is a podcast, and I listen to a lot of podcasts and a lot of comedy ones in particular. And one of the most common advertisers on comedy podcasts is this company, BetterHelp. I feel like I've heard a BetterHelp ad about 10,000 times over the past couple of years, and maybe that's somewhat, more of a parallel at least than Seamless or something to what you're doing. And I remember thinking at first, like, especially during the pandemic, like, oh, this is great. Like, there's people who are hurting out there and they can't see a doctor. It's hard to find a therapist. But then I've talked to a couple of people who are therapists and heard other things that like BetterHelp is actually like not very well run. And maybe that's why they're advertising on podcasts constantly. Yeah. How do you see that sort of like a therapist relationship is different from the relationship with a doctor who's prescribing, a specific medicine. But what are you thinking about as a way to avoid like pitfalls that could make people angry?
It's so funny, that you mentioned BetterHelp specifically. My mom is a therapist, and we've gotten in a number of debates around sort of the merits of a BetterHelp. She comes from of course, more traditional in-person approach and likes to see that model, a really high-touch model, maintained. And, I'm not an expert in BetterHelp, but I think what's interesting about them that probably is relevant to Hey Jane as well is that, to your point, it just speaks to the massive degree in which people are underserved by the current healthcare system.
Mhm.
I don't know if their solution is the right one. Again, I'm not saying it is or it isn't. I don't know too much about it, but they're does need to be, there needs to be new ways that allow us to scale a very limited supply of healthcare providers to meet the needs of everybody. And what happens in the absence of that is if we go for these traditional approaches, I think in the case of BetterHelp, striving for what might be a more perfect model of really hands-on care, the people who get it are the ones who can afford to pay a lot for it. And so I actually don't think this applies as much to our model, frankly, just because there are some differences in how it's, the product that we're providing. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting question of access versus like scalability.
Right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of I've seen complaints from both, the users of BetterHelp, the patients, and the therapists themselves who say, the expectations were unrealistic or things like that. So yeah, it's sort of, when I first heard about it, I was like, wow, what a great idea. And then the execution seems to have been bad. So that's a bummer.
One other point there is I just think like the incentives matter so much for, where's the funding coming from? What are the primary motives of not just the founders or the leadership team, but just everyone involved with influence there. And so again, I'm not an expert in BetterHelp, but when I look to some models that have more clearly been problematic, also often in the mental health care space where, we've seen recently founders get arrested based off of, over prescribing of controlled substances. There's an incentive to grow really, really fast if you take certain types of money. And so we've also been really thoughtful about where we take money from and what that sort of would encourage or even force us to do. We're a public benefit corporation, and we've really been selective about taking on only mission-driven investors, which
Oh, that's interesting. Can you explain what that is for people who haven't heard that term before?
for sure. So a
Public benefit corporation.
Yeah, it's just a new kind of entity structure that allows, typically in a corporation, you are legally obliged. You are a fiduciary for your shareholders. You have to do things that optimize shareholder value. And if not, you are in violation of that like legal duty. With a public benefit corporation, it allows more flexibility. You are both beholden to your shareholders, but also the stakeholders benefiting from the mission of what you're doing. We, fortunately, I would say, have been pretty aligned in the interest of those two so far. But if we ever were presented with a decision where there might be a trade-off between profit and mission, we have the flexibility to balance that in a way that is, unique to this type of entity. But also, like, that is getting sort of into these legal details that, like, maybe are less important than just like who's on your board, who's motivating you to do certain types of things.
So over the past, 6 months or so, almost every piece of technology I've interacted with has added a new feature involving artificial intelligence, including the Zoom we're using right now. It just popped up for the first time for me that there's now an AI companion for Zoom. What do you think about artificial intelligence, either in general or in relation to your company?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think it's exciting, some of the things that may come from it. I think it's still very early, and especially given the high stakes of using AI in healthcare,
Mhm.
I do think a little bit more needs to be seen on that front. The risk of hallucination of AI just making something up in a standard customer service interaction where I'm trying to return a product, which happened recently and it was making
Yeah.
no sense. It's annoying, but it's not going to like meaningfully injure me. The stakes are different in healthcare. And so I think in the future, in the near future, there's an opportunity for it to like assist our team in pulling up relevant resources to share to a patient. But I don't think we're there yet in terms of it being able to replace actual clinical interaction.
Right. Yeah, as someone who's only a consumer of these products, it seems the way they've been pushing it and that everything is now like there's some AI aspect to it built in seems totally nuts to me. I joked recently it'd be like if 4 years ago, like Microsoft Word was like, okay, we're like crypto now, or we're on the blockchain now, and like forcing you to interact with blockchain related things. And like that was revealed to be like a giant bubble or scam or something. So it just seems crazy that they're like tech companies are going all in on this new area that's so untested. Yeah, I don't know.
And
Yeah,
why? Exactly. It's just sort of sprinkling the AI language on top of something or forcing it into a use case that no one really needs. For
yeah,
some things, you know.
yeah. It seems I don't know. I'm very skeptical of all AI related things. So okay, so let's say that a woman wants a medication abortion, and here's about, hey Jay, how does it work? What's the process?
Yeah. So patients will come onto our site. They'll get lots of really easy and comforting information on what medication abortion is, how it works with HGene. They're then able to complete their clinical intake online 24/7, just answer some questions about their pregnancy, their medical history. That information then gets sent over to our team. And typically within 24 hours, one of our providers will reach out to answer any questions and, if it's appropriate, confirm that prescription. From there, medication gets shipped directly to your doorstep. That could be to your home, it could be to a pickup point like a post office counter. Um, so you're able to get your care very quickly. Once your treatment is confirmed, you have on demand access to our team for any clinical questions, but also emotional support. So if you just want someone to chat with, sort of like having a friend with their hand on your shoulder throughout, that's available. We also have something called the Lounge. It's our patient community for sort of peer to peer support in a less clinical way. People find it to be, very normalizing, very validating for whatever they might be experiencing. They'll complete treatment at home. We give them really detailed instructions. Again, we're there every step of the way. And then we do follow up to make sure everything went as planned.
So if a woman comes to you and is the pregnancy has progressed past the point at which medication abortion can be done, what happens then?
Yeah, so we can treat up to 11 weeks. If someone's beyond that, or for whatever reason they're not eligible, we'll refer them to a resource that would be more appropriate. There's some really great directories out there and other ways to find links to care that would be a good fit.
Mhm. Where do you see this? Do you see this becoming a, where you hoped it to become a 50 state thing, an international thing? How does, like, what's your vision for, what ideal, situation in 5 or 10 years for the company?
Yeah, we would, of course, love to be able to provide treatment to patients and as many patients as possible. Right now, we're in 20 states plus DC, and that does cover about 85% of all abortions in the US, just
Hmm.
based off of sort of that concentration of where they take place now post jobs. There are, legal restrictions to us expanding beyond those. It'll be interesting to see how they evolve. Some progressive states are putting into place more protections that allow providers to provide care across the country, but those, still need to be sort of tested by the courts. The other thing that we're very interested in doing is just becoming the most financially accessible platform for care. We see, of course, I'm very bullish on digital health. I think it is tremendously more convenient, accessible, private, supportive. But for the most part, a lot of the models today have been cash pay only. So it's hard for people to afford something to pay out of pocket when they could get it subsidized or for free from their insurance. So Hey Jane has really been leading the way and getting on insurance coverage. We're moving into Medicaid soon. And once we have that, we could expand into other products that we know our patients need as well, other types of medical services to, again, make them not only really convenient, discreet, private, but also affordable.
Do most of the patients who come to you, do they pay a pocket? Do they have insurance? Like, your insurance changes, you have to go to a new doctor or something is always very stressful. Are they gonna take it? Or sometimes, if you call a new doctor, like the first thing they ask you is what's your insurance, even before they ask you why you're calling to begin with. How do you handle that?
Yeah. So right now we accept a mix of payment options depending on what's best for an individual patient. So we do have, cash pay patients, but our cash pay prices are all determined based off of a sliding scale. So patients just self-report their income, and then we're able to provide them with a price that should, meet their needs. We're typically
Hmm.
substantially less than in-person care just for the cost of treatment, and then patients can save, like hundreds or even thousands of dollars on travel, overnight stays, missed work, childcare, all these other logistical expenses that wouldn't be covered by insurance, even in a best case scenario. We partner with abortion funds as well, which are these wonderful nonprofits that can provide additional financial assistance to patients who need it. And then we do accept insurance, and we're able to cover the majority of the population in the states that we're in now. We're in network with the big payers.
Is there an issue with, if you have Medicaid or some other form of insurance, getting paid, or how does that work? And does it matter who the president is at any particular time, whether they'll pay for an abortion pill?
That's a really good question. So Medicaid is something that we are working hard towards now. It is complex. It varies state by state. There are regulatory hurdles that we are, very focused on overcoming right now. In terms of how the president affects this, for better, for generally for worse, but the answer to that should be no. In part because there is this horrible federal law in place right now. It's called the Hyde Amendment, and it prevents federal Medicaid funding from being used towards abortion anywhere. However, states can choose to allocate their state level funding towards abortion care. So again, varies state by state, but it's determined on a state level.
You know, we're recording this in mid-July. The outcome of the election is very uncertain. If Trump wins, is that going to affect your business?
Listen, I genuinely think it is to be determined. We can only go off of what he's saying now. And I think for very good reason, people are reluctant to believe things that he says. However, based off his statements, he has, asserted that he thinks it is a states' rights issue, which would essentially maintain the status quo. We just had the first of the debates, which, I think a lot of the actual content of that debate was shrouded by the vibes. But Trump did plainly state during that debate he supported the recent Supreme Court decision around sustained access to medication abortion. He got some funny things wrong there. He said the Supreme Court approved the medication, which is not how drug approval work. But nevertheless, he did say he agreed with the outcome. And so if we're basing it off what he says, I think there is, I think it could get worse. They could do later stage bans. The most restrictive we've seen have been around 15, 16 weeks. It certainly wouldn't be my preference. However, I do think he recognizes, if nothing else, that abortion is a losing issue. The vast majority of Americans, even if you look at combined data across political parties, they support abortion access. He knows it's a losing issue, and hopefully, he reflects the will of the people on that.
Yeah, it's so paradoxical or bizarre or just absurd that, he himself seems to not care about abortion at all. And yet his, Supreme Court appointments are what overturned Roe, but he knows that that's politically unpopular, but he has to sort of pretend because of his conservative base that, overturning Roe was a great thing, even though he, as someone who doesn't care, has no ideology aside from keeping himself in power, he knows that it's a loser. So he has to, it's so, it's just like another absurd thing that's happened over the past decade.
Well, to that point, I think also just worth sort of mentioning Project 2025. He's denying that he's aware of its existence while also commenting on the content of it. It's all his former aides, but he's really made an effort to distance himself from much of it, including the abortion rhetoric in there. But the abortion policies suggested by that document are extreme. Like that would be a very, very terrifying future we'd be looking at if those were to actually be implemented.
So for people who care about the laws around abortion and reproductive health, is it a state by state? It's now a state by state thing. Like that's where the real legislative battles and referendums and stuff like that are going to happen, you think?
Yes, I think that in terms of where the policy efforts will take place, it's at a state by state level. But the reality is, like, people need abortion care across the country in every single state. And so it remains a national issue. There are a number of important ballot referenda taking place in the next election, Florida and a number of other important swing states. And, we hope to see good turnout there. Every time a ballot initiative is been put up to vote, it's always 100% of the time it's gone the pro-choice way. So
Right.
we're hoping to see that continue. And, the other thing I think people might just keep in mind is supporting these abortion funds who are helping people travel and otherwise get the care that they need if they're in a state where the policies aren't currently supportive.
I think that's about all the questions I have. Is there anything else you want to mention before we wrap up?
I think we covered a lot. You referenced Comstock. We could talk about that. That's
Sure. Yeah. So,
one.
yeah. Okay. Well, so this is a 19th century law that banned mailing obscene material and could also include, if it was, revived or something, could include your product, but also pornography or even the instructions on how to do something that is considered obscene or something like that.
Yep.
And it's, in the Roe era, it would have been impossible for this to affect abortion. And now possibly, some conservative legal types are starting to talk it up again. Yeah. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the one that I am most concerned about. You might be able to tell from my prior answers, like generally feeling optimistic about some of the other things I think people are very concerned about. But Comstock is a law that's on the books. It's never been enforced, but it is incredibly broad. It's all of the things you mentioned, but it's anything or instrument that could be used to cause an abortion. So not just abortion pills, but rubber gloves, forceps, like truly anything that could be used to cause an abortion. It's very scary, and I'm hoping. I think it hasn't gotten enough attention to date. I think it's just starting to surface, and I'm hoping that bright light is shown on it so that we could do something about it before it's too late. It needs to be legislated away.
Yeah, it's quite strange that it's still on the books, this antiquated law, and yeah, and the type of people who are the Project 2025 conservative legal thinkers, movers, and shakers, like they see this as an opening that they could exploit to crack down on things. And it's like, so it's about the mail because like it was, in the 19th century, that's all all there was. But we still use the mail quite quite a lot, including your product. Is your stuff sent through the USPS, or does that affect things at all? Or could you switch to FedEx if in some nightmarish reality where government agents were sorting through the regular mail?
Yeah. So unfortunately, the Comstock law refers to the U.S. mails. It does include any common carrier. So not to go like too much in the boring details, but it's USPS, also FedEx and UPS would be included. So it would have to move towards something like a private carrier. Like the way I like to explain this is if you get, you order something on Amazon, if it gets delivered by FedEx or UPS, that counts. If it gets delivered by one of those Amazon trucks, that's private courier. So it'd have to be beyond even just like the privatized courier systems.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling to think about that. And yeah, so hopefully that doesn't doesn't happen. Okay, so is it just heyjane.com if people want to
Yeah.
look at your site?
Yes. HeyJane.com. Check us out.
And
For
who is
care.
Jane? What is Jane a reference to?
Jade is sort of a reference to just a number of sort of shoulders that we feel this work is built upon. There was the Jane Collective in Chicago in the pre-Roe era that helped people get access to safe abortion care. In particular, it's something that we were inspired by.
Oh, yes, I have heard just a little bit about that. That's interesting. Is there a historical figure named Jane who inspires this term?
I think that it's just a common, in that case and just in general, it's sort of a prototypical stand-in for all people who need abortion care. No particular Jane, we're all Jane is sort of how we think about it.
Oh, that's interesting. And yeah, there was what, Jane magazine in the 80s, right? That was like Sassy or something. And then Exo Jane was also a website. Um,
Yep,
yeah,
Jane Roe.
when you were thinking about branding and stuff like that, but were you a lot of online websites have strange names like Yahoo or Google or something. What did you think when you were coming up with what you would call your company?
That's a good question. So we wanted something that felt friendly, approachable, warm, very personable, like wanted it to sort of feel like the friend you would call when you have a need that you need some help with. The story for it was I was doing like a pitch competition or something, and we'd been operating under another name that I learned was taken.
Mm.
And so we did like an hour and a half brainstorm, came up with this before the deadline, and we just felt it really represented what we wanted to be.
Oh, that's interesting because there's whole industries that'll come up with like new names for products and stuff like that, so that you sort of just like crash it in 90 minutes is that's interesting. Okay, so anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
No, yeah, check us out, heyjane.com. We have something called the Unwhisper Network that sends out communications on, how you can engage in the issue, keep yourself informed, help keep your friends informed if that's of interest. So you could find out more about that at heyjane.com as well. Oh, and on social media at heyjane.
Hygiene Health. Okay. And the links to these things will be in the show notes, and people can rate, review, and do all that other stuff that podcasts always tell people to do at the end. Okay. Well, thanks for coming on and talking about this interesting company that you're involved with, and thanks to all the listeners out there. And we'll see you again next time.
Thank you so much for having me.